The rain had made the neon sign of Mason's Diner smear the color of cheap rubies across the puddled sidewalk. Inside, the light was warm, the booths worn smooth by elbows and secrets. People talked low, spooned at coffee and the clock above. The pie case ticked like a metronome for the slow heartbeat of the town. Lena Rivers worked behind the counter like a seamstress with a single familiar stitch. She moved with that economy born of years on her feet, plates in, plates out. A smile for the lonely, a joke for the regulars. At 27, her hands had the callous maps of a life that had had to be steady for others. She'd raised herself since her mother's death and raised her little brother, Malik, through late-night study sessions and mac-and-cheese dinners, when money was thin. Her skin was a deep, warm brown that the late-afternoon sun in the diner made butter gold. She had learned sign language young. Her mother had been an interpreter for the local community center before the cancer came. Between treatments, she would curl Lena into her lap and show her the hands that could speak when voices failed. Those lessons had been a kind of secret. Language between them, a private treasure Lena kept in a pocket of memory. When money and time forced choices, Lena left college and kept the job at Mason's. The sign language lessons became dimmer, like the edges of a well-thumbed photograph. The bell over the door jingled. He came in like a shadow peeled from the rain. Coat dark with wet, a narrow tie loosened, hair at his collar. He was tall, his movements precise and reserved. He chose a corner booth as if distance were armor. Lena wiped a counter with a practiced motion, then approached him with the menu held in both hands. "Evening," she said. "What can I get for you?" His eyes met hers and flicked away before he could reply. He opened a small leather notebook, scribbled with a quick, efficient hand, and angled it toward her. "I'm deaf. Can I order by writing?" She blinked. A surprising, simple yes, and the shape of that word sat on the tip of her tongue. For a moment, memory did the work for her. The careful fingers of her mother forming the alphabet. The way lips and hands could meet in the middle of silence. Lena's fingertips went cold. Then a softness came to her face. "You don't have to write," she said, and she formed the sign automatically, clear, gentle, practiced, the gesture for food, then the sign for order, then the sign for please. Each movement smoothed like the tide returning after a long absence. It was a private reflex she had not shown a customer in years. He froze, surprised in a way that made his face look vulnerable. He set down his pen, regarded her more closely. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes, then tapped the notebook, again. "You know sign?" he wrote. She felt heat in her chest. "My mother taught me," she signed back, fingers precise though slightly shy. She spoke it aloud as well. "My mother taught me. I don't use it much anymore. What can I bring?" "You?" He studied her hands as if the world had rearranged. Then he pointed to a cafe favorite and wrote the word, adding a small line underneath. "Black coffee. No sugar." He hesitated for a moment, underlined it twice, then added, "Do you mind?" Lena shook her head. "Not at all." She signed, "I'll be back with it." He nodded, gratitude like a small pulse across his face. She left with the coffee in hand and 1,000 thoughts trailing her back to the counter. After she brought the order and refilled his cup a few times, the man, who finally wrote his name on the pad as Ethan Carlisle, became a fixture. He returned most nights for a week. He never once used the phone. He always wrote, or more often, he and Lena signed. The gestures slid between them at first like polished stones, simple orders, comments about the weather, the way the rain seemed to make the town move slower. But conversation deepened without the friction of sound. When a lull came, Lena would find herself telling him small things she couldn't always say aloud. About Malik's scholarship application. About the rent rising. About the hollow place left by a mother's absence. He would sign back slowly at first, then with more confidence, his hands surprisingly sure, deft in the quiet way of a man who had taken instruction and learned to speak, with his palms. One rainy evening, when thunder rumbled against the glass like a soft drum, he signed, "I don't like being treated differently. I like places where the person is the person." Not the title. He had written at least once that he kept a low profile. He asked things in the manner of a guest who feared intrusion. But Lena's curiosity, practical and stubborn, sprang to life. He was careful. When she questioned him about work, he wrote short statements with the economy of someone used to saying a lot with little ink. "I run things. I was in town for an acquisition. Quiet is good for thinking." He would then sign, almost shyly, "I wanted to be anonymous." Lena's hands hesitated, then formed the sign for CEO. She'd known that word from late-night news articles her mother would read. When she signed it, Ethan's shoulders tightened with a twitch she could not miss, and afterward he only wrote, "Yes." But here, "I eat like everyone else." There was something about him that tugged Lena. Partly pity, she hated to admit. Partly fascination. Partly the way her old life simplified in his company. He was always precise with his hands and surprisingly gentle when he signed. When he told her, fingers steady, that he'd learned sign language because his sister had been deaf, a picture patched itself into place, a private tenderness in him for the world made quiet. As the weeks passed, Martha, the diner's manager, and the unofficial mayor of Mason's began to notice. "You've got a new regular," she observed with a conspiratorial gleam as Lena wiped the counter. "Is he bringing tips to make up for his mystery?" Lena smiled and shook her head. She didn't tell Martha how his presence settled her, the way a clock steadies the seconds. But she also didn't tell Ethan about the collection of unpaid notices tacked to the bulletin board above the jukebox, the way Malik sometimes went hungry to stretch groceries longer, or how Lena had stopped renting a room to save the money for the utility bills. She protected those facts the way one protects raw edges. One night, the diner's regulars trickled out early. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and breathless. Ethan lingered. The booth light cast soft shadows. "You always close at 10, he wrote. "You never stay late?" She finished drying a stack of mugs, then leaned on the counter. "I do when there are parties, or when Malik needs me. Otherwise I need sleep," she signed, then smiled. "And money." He nodded, slowly. He signed, "I would like to invite you to dinner." Without hesitation, Lena felt an undercurrent of electricity run along her skin. Not a romantic electricity, at least not at first, but curiosity glazed with the knowledge that invitations weren't trivial. He wrote, "Not here. Somewhere quiet. I want to pay you properly for your time." She shook her head. "I don't—" She began aloud and then stopped, heart tripping at her own sudden awareness that their worlds were not on the same plane. The word pay hung there like an offer that might fix things she didn't talk about. She declined with a soft shake of the head and the sign for no thanks. "I have work tomorrow." Ethan didn't press it. Instead, he smiled and wrote, "Maybe another time." He kept coming to the booth, though, and their conversations took on a softer architecture. Stories of childhood, shared jokes about the peculiar habits of people in small towns, and occasional silences that were not empty but companionable. 1. Slow Sunday, when the diner smelled of burnt coffee and cinnamon buns, a black sedan rolled to a stop outside Mason's. A man in a suit stepped out, briefcase in hand, and a woman with a collapsible banner set up on the sidewalk. Lena didn't think much of it until she saw the logo on the banner, Carlisle Developments. She froze halfway through stacking plates as a group of men in crisp outerwear met the diner's owner at the curb. Inside, the regulars muttered. "They're buying land downtown," murmured Joe from the booth. Said they're planning to build a plaza. New stores. Mason's Corner sat on a small plot that had once been family-owned. The diner's mortgage was an old, comfortable thing. Mason, the owner, had older blood than the bank, but the talk that night pulled at Lena like a siren. She watched Ethan, the man who had sat in her booth for weeks, silent and confident, step outside to speak with his men. He never looked up. He barely noticed her through the steam in the glass. She wanted to confront him, to ask what he knew, because if Carlisle Developments was planning big changes downtown, Mason's could be under threat. But she stopped herself. Why? Because part of her wondered if the man in the booth had any power here at all, or because she feared the truth, that the person she'd come to know and sign might be unrecognizable when the cape of title settled around him. That night she found it hard to sleep. Malik was home from class with a strange intensity, talking about his scholarship interview. Lena made coffee, her hands trembling. She thought of the unpaid bills and of the smell of hot grease that had always been home. She thought of Ethan's. Hands, careful, polite, the hands of someone who could command a whole lot, and of the way he had, whether intentionally or not, kept himself off the radar. The next week, the tension mounted. Flyers for a town meeting had sprouted like stubborn weeds. Community redevelopment plan, public consultation. Mason's regulars lined up to talk. Shopkeepers fretted about rents. Opposing groups jostled for presence. Carlisle Developments had promised new jobs, modern space, which in some ways sounded good, in other ways felt as if every small corner would be priced out. Lena avoided the meeting. She watched through the diner's rain-streaked window as the town's life churned. She served coffee while people shouted and signed when asked. Ethan continued to come, always occupying his booth like a sentinel. Sometimes he asked about the meeting. Once, when a heated voice rose in the diner over the fate of a brick-and-mortar bakery, he signed, "Are you worried?" Fully aware of the shape and weight of the question. She nodded. "Yes. Why?" he asked, fingers gentle. "You can fight them. You have a voice in meetings." He smiled an apologetic half-smile and signed, "If you want." Lena felt the bruise of something. She was part of this town, not its spearhead. She had no lawyer, no voice that could drown out the money behind development, but she had a voice, her hands, her memory, the muscle of her being. That night, she told him the truth through signs, the mortgage notices, the way the landlord had been talking about selling, how Mason's had been here before most of the new facades, and should it close, it would leave corners of Old Town empty and thin. Ethan listened, his fingers folding in mid-air like pages turning. When she finished, he didn't write the word sorry. Instead, he signed a thoughtful question. "Do you want help?" The hands were careful, but the offer was there. She looked up at him. She could have said yes at once. She could have let someone with money patch the ragged edges of her life, fix the roof and buy the overdue groceries with the wave of a white-gloved hand. She could have accepted and kept Mason safe, but there was a fine line between help and replacement. "Why would you help?" she asked, fingers moving slowly. He met her hands with his own and signed a simple truth. "Because I was helped once. Because I remember when someone treated me like a person, and it changed how I lived." He paused, then added, "Because I like being here, because you are honest." Something in Lena wanted to believe that. Another part of her bristled at the notion of being a charity cause. She breathed out, the exhale soft as the steam from coffee, and signed, "If you help, I'll do my part. I won't be a charity story." He smiled, and it was the first time she saw him without his usual cautious reserve. His mouth was genuine. "Then let's talk about options," he signed. In the weeks that followed, Carlisle Development's presence in town tightened like a ring. Papers were served. The meeting left a residue of uncertainty that made people speak in clipped sentences. One morning, Lena came in early and found Mason sitting at the counter, a gravity to his face Lena hadn't seen before. He slid a paper across the counter. It was a notice, offer of purchase. The numbers were clean, cold, and bright. "You know anything?" Mason asked Lena, voice low. She shook her head. Everything she had inside wanted to be angry. But at whom? At the world? At Ethan? She felt the ground shift. The man she had trusted, the man who had fed her confidences, was part of an engine that could crush what was home to her. The diner grew quiet as the town waited. Then, like slow storms rolling in, groups formed. Those who welcomed change and those who wanted to anchor the old places and faces. Phones lit up with articles about redevelopment that had little space for featherlight concerns like the ad breaks. At the ends of conversations, one line in a longer piece mentioned investment opportunities, another talked about historic preservation, while asking pointedly if the cost was worth keeping small businesses in place. Finally, the inevitable. Meeting was called. Carlisle Developments would present a proposal. Lena decided she could not be quiet. She worked a double shift that night to cover Malik's tutoring and then went to the hall, heart pounding like a fist in a drum. She sat in the back and watched Ethan. He wore a suit now without the humbling anonymity of the diner booth, and watched a side of him she had not known. The practiced pause, the polished cadence of influence. He spoke with a measured clarity about community benefit and sustainable economic growth. The words felt like a basin poured over the town. They were clean on the surface but might drown what lay beneath. At the microphone, Lena realized how small a single person could seem in a room. She rose like a hand pulling itself up a rope. When it was her turn, she went to the microphone and with trembling hands began to speak. She told the room about Masons, about the way it had been a constant in lives for decades. She signed when she could and spoke when she needed to. She told them about Malik and the scholarships and the meals that had stretched until morning, and about a mother who had taught her to sign and then gone away too soon. Her voice broke once, twice. People turned toward her in a hush. Ethan sat, stone still. When she finished, a silence collapsed over the room like snow. People shifted, some with empathy, some with annoyance at the delay in progress. The board thanked her politely and moved to vote. Carlisle's proposal passed with a small majority. It was enough. There would be relocation packages, they said. There would be planning. There would also be time. Months of negotiation while architects drew lines that sometimes looked suspiciously like erasers. Outside the town hall, Ethan found Lena. He had watched everything like a man measuring wind. He wrote slowly, "I'm sorry." She returned a sign that meant something more complicated. "You're part of that decision." He didn't respond with a defense. Instead, he signed, "I want to help you personally." "You're the company," she said aloud. "You can't help me without, I don't know, messing with people." He met her eyes. He signed carefully. "I asked for permission to intervene. I can help keep Masons, help with relocation, help with finances, and an offer. If you want to continue running, a place I can help you open a small cafe under a grant I'll sponsor. No strings attached, just practical support. I don't want to be the kind of man who causes harm and walks away." Lena's mouth tasted of salt. Was this a sincere desire to help, or an attempt to wipe clean a conscience? She had to decide. Pride pushed back like a tide. But then she thought of Malik, of late nights narrowing the budget, of the fact that the world sometimes used money like a universal solvent. "Why?" she asked him in a whisper. He signed, "Because when I was young, a waitress helped my family when we were low. She gave me more than a meal. She made me feel human. I want to do that for someone else." Lena remembered the small kindnesses she had known in childhood. The neighbor who lent sugar in a crisis, the interpreter who took her mother's calls when she couldn't. She thought of how quick the world could be to reduce a life to balance sheets. She thought of Ethan's hands, how sure they had been when trying to explain regret. She let herself be practical. "All right," she signed, then spoke it. "Let's talk terms." What followed next was not a fairy tale of instant rescue. Carlyle's legal team drew precise lines around any financial help. There were contracts and schedules, red ink and signatures. Mason's got a relocation plan that allowed it to move across a small lot a few blocks away, less visible but still in the heart of town. The company offered a community grant that Lena could apply for to open a small cafe. Ethan personally arranged mentorship and offered to connect her with a culinary instructor he'd contracted. Malik received a scholarship co-sponsored. Through a local donor the company introduced at the school board. People had opinions. Some saw Lena as a heroine getting her due. Others labeled her a sellout, an example of gentrification's smiling face. For Lena, there were nights of celebration, and nights when she sat alone on the counter wiping plates, stomach hollow with doubt. She never stopped signing with Ethan, and their conversations deepened. She learned more about Ethan beyond the title. He had been raised in a suburban house with a sister who went deaf after a childhood fever. The family had scrambled for interpreters. The small kindness of a waitress at a motorway diner one winter had given Ethan a warm memory, a human moment in a career otherwise occupied with numbers and acquisitions. That memory, he told her in quiet, signed sentences, shaped the way he tried to negotiate with his conscience. There were awkward moments, town gossip, late-night whispers, and the anger of those who felt a company had a plan and people had to comply privately. Lena felt the weight of being between communities. Sometimes she resented Ethan for being able to do things with the flick of an executive wrist. Other times she resented herself for accepting the help. The turning point came when Mason's new location was being renovated. The town had rallied, and as the new sign went up, Lena felt something like fear and excitement coiled together. The ribbon would be cut soon. On the last night before the opening, Lena closed early to prepare the kitchen and then wandered through the empty diner. The cash register clicked closed. The jukebox hummed a last lonely tune. Ethan walked in without the drama, coat removed, looking as if he had strolled through rain again. He stood in the center of the floor and watched Lena folding napkins. "You did it," he signed. He sounded as if he were not just congratulating her, but proud, a careful glow like a lighthouse. She smiled. "We did it," she corrected. Mason kept his faith, the town helped, Malik's scholarship came through, and you paid a lot in legal fees. He laughed silently, the expression softening into something real. "You were not my charity story. You were my choice," he signed. He paused and then added another line. "I want you to consider something. I'm offering you a job offer at my company, not a takeover, not to run my events, an investment, a role to lead a community outreach cafe program in cities we work in. You'd be running a chain of neighborhood cafes with autonomy. It's a lot, and it would mean leaving town sometimes. You don't have to say yes." Lena's hands stilled. The idea of leaving Mason's was like proposing to cut out the corner of her own chest. The town was her story. The smell of coffee and bacon was the scent of a life she'd built with stubborn, threaded hands. But the notion of secure pay, a chance to influence real spaces for small communities, and the possibility of lifting Malik into a life that didn't require stomach knuckles, those were powerful too. Ethan's offer trembled with possibility. "Why me?" she asked, with fingers that would not stop shaking. He looked at her and signed. "Because you remember what it's like. Because you speak with hands. Because you won't accept tokenism. Because you have grit, I've seen. Because I think you can bring dignity where we usually bring checklists." She thought about the waitress who had once warmed a tray in a snowy rest stop and about the woman, years ago, who'd taught her to sign. She thought about Mason's counter in Malik's textbooks. She imagined, for a dizzy second, the model of cafe after cafe run by someone who had come from where the customers came from, someone who knew the taste of cramped budgets and proud labor. "I'll think about it," she said, and the words tasted and sounded incomplete. Ethan nodded and left. The next morning, Lena found a folder on the counter with a packet of materials about the role and the contract. He had also left something else, a small hand-stitched card with a short message in sign language, written in ink for the hearing. "World to read, be you. Lead your way." The weeks that followed were a study in wait and patience. Decision-making gnawed. Lena didn't want to betray the town by leaving, but she could not ignore a chance to make larger changes. She negotiated terms. The job would include an office that allowed her to spend time in town, resources to create training programs for people from low-income neighborhoods, and an agreement that any new cafe in her hometown would commit to hiring locally. She insisted on community oversight. Ethan took her stipulations and met each one with a willingness that surprised her. When the official offer came, airtight, generous, and oddly personal, she signed. It took courage and sorrow in equal measures to tell Mason she might have to leave after a year. He hugged her with the kind of hug that anchors you and then let go. A grown man performed through the filter of having had to be practical many times before. During her first months in the role, Lena traveled. She started programs in neighborhoods with names she had read on maps but never spoken aloud. She visited a high school and taught a class on customer service tied with life skills. She set up scholarships and mentorships. She worked hard, and sometimes hard enough that exhaustion smudged into her days. Her phone calls home grew more frequent but briefer, until one evening Malik called, voice shaky and small. "You did it," he said. "You made it so Masons could stay." Lena smiled down at her hands. She had left not to escape the town, but because she believed she could bring the town's dignity into more places. One night, months later, an emergency meeting burst into Lena's calendar. Carlisle Developments had been accused publicly of bulldozing without adequate consultation. The press was out, and the protests were louder than she expected. A local reporter asked pointed questions about whether Ethan was really sincere or whether the company's philanthropy was just PR. Lena thought of the way the town had watched her, trusting, suspicious, hopeful. She thought of the times she had stood at Mason's counter, hands raw from wiping and smiling. She thought about the risks of working for a company that could also hurt what it meant to care. She went to the press conference and spoke not as an executive's ambassador, but as someone who had known the town. She signed, she spoke, she bridged. She told the story of the little cafeteria in the rain where a man had sat and been treated like a person. She told how she had negotiated terms that meant employment for many locals. She described how the A company allowed a small cafe to remain and promised to fund a community oversight board. She did not absolve Carlisle. She acknowledged wrongs and pledged to be vigilant. The town watched as Lena stood in front of the microphones, and then, later that week, as a vote passed that would require developers to implement binding community oversight. Carlisle's board accepted the new rules with a bitter look, but compliance. The town breathed. Money and justice did not always run the same river, but for a time they met. Years later, Lena stood behind the counter of a small cafe she had opened under the program's grant, its sign modest and hand-painted. It was not Mason's. Some pieces of the old days couldn't be replicated, but it was honest, staffed with young people from neighborhoods who had learned training at an apprentice table Lena had helped build. Malik stopped by on his lunch break. He had graduated and had a bright, adjusted stride now. He hugged her and mouthed, "Thank you." Ethan visited less often than he had at first. When he did, They spoke with the ease of two people who had stitched themselves into each other's histories. Once, during one of his stayovers at town, he sat across from her in the early hours and signed, "Do you regret?" His fingers trembled. She thought of the night he had first come into Mason's and shown her the notebook with the neat sentence, "I'm deaf. Can I order by writing?" She thought of the afternoons of quiet understanding, of the decisions and compromises made in the name of community care. She shook her head and signed back, "No." I learned to speak louder with my hands and to listen better with my heart. He smiled, and for a moment they both sat in the hush of a place that had borne them differently. Lena thought about all the quiet hands that had taught her, the mother who raised her, the unnamed waitress who had warmed a life with a tray, and she felt, in that central part of her chest, a soft, satisfied ache. She had done the work of being both the person helped and the one who helped others. In time, the town changed in ways both expected and surprising. Some storefronts gleamed glassier than before. Others kept their doors sticky with memories. People moved in and moved out. Mason's kept a small plaque behind the counter in the old location, a list of names who had worked there through the decades, and a line in smaller letters, "For the hands that speak when voices are gone." On a rainy evening, not unlike the night he had first come in, Ethan came to her cafe. He hesitated in the doorway, as if the threshold carried the weight of what had happened between them. He signed, slowly, "Are you happy?" Lena watched the rain stitch the streetlights into silver thread. She looked at the hands she still used daily. Hands that had washed dishes, counted bills, signed hope, and signed back, yes. Because we keep trying. Because we make space. Because people matter to someone. Ethan closed his fingers around hers, and for the first time since the bright new contracts were signed and the debates had raged, there was no question about titles. He was a man. She was a woman who had built a life out of small, honest things. And the silence between them, once an obstacle, had become a language in itself, a quiet cadence that did not demand explanation. Outside, rain shaped the world brief and clear. Inside, the cafe hummed with low conversation and the easy clatter of cups. Lena watched a young server glide across the floor to hand a bowl to a customer and saw in the gesture the lesson her mother had taught her, that language could be many things: voice, hands, action, so long as it was generous. She thought then of the stranger who had written on a small leather pad and the consequences of that chance. A company's hand that could have been a wrecking ball had chosen, by the measure of one man's memory, to be a ladder. It did not erase the scars. It did not rewrite every wrong, but it changed enough. In a life made of small mercies, that was sometimes the only thing anyone could hope for. The bell chimed as another customer entered. Lena smiled and signed the simple welcome she had been taught in a much smaller kitchen years ago. Food, coffee, stay. The hands of the present answered, and the story moved on. Gentle, human, stitched together by the many hands that had learned to speak in a world that would not always listen. And the rain, patient and steady, kept washing the glass until the reflections looked like possibilities rather than endings.